The Wells family dining room was grand enough to impress royalty, yet tense enough to suffocate anyone seated at the long mahogany table. Sophie Wells gripped the stem of her wine glass tighter than necessary, her perfectly polished nails tapping against the crystal as though each tap might shatter the silence. Across from her, her father, Charles Wells, adjusted his cufflinks with the casual arrogance of a man used to controlling the world with a single signature. To his right sat her mother, Caroline, perfectly poised, her pearls glowing under the chandelier light. And at the far end of the table, leaning back with an unreadable expression, sat Mark Anderson. His dark eyes were sharp, his jawline sharper, and Sophie hated that even in this ridiculous moment, he looked effortlessly confident. Her father finally broke the silence. "Sophie, Mark, you both know why we're here tonight," Charles said, his voice steady and commanding. "The Wells Corporation and Anderson Enterprises are hanging by threads. Competitors are circling like vultures. This marriage is no longer a matter of choice, it's survival." Sophie set her glass down with a little more force than she intended. "Marriage," she repeated, her tone sharp. "Dad, this isn't the 1800s. You can't just throw me into some deal like I'm an asset to be traded." Caroline reached across the table, resting her hand gently over Sophie's. "Sweetheart, it's not like that. You and Mark grew up around each other. This isn't about trading. You're ensuring your future, our future." Mark finally leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. His voice was calm, deep, and annoyingly smooth. "Let's not pretend this is romantic. It's business. Your father's empire is crumbling, Sophie, and so is mine. If we don't combine forces, both companies sink within a year. This marriage keeps us afloat." Sophie shot him a glare. "And you're okay with that? With marrying someone you barely tolerate? You'd actually go through with this circus?" A smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Don't flatter yourself. I'm not thrilled either. But unlike you, I understand sacrifice. My father taught me that sometimes the right move isn't the one you want, it's the one that saves everyone else." Her chest tightened with anger, and something else she didn't care to name. She had always found Mark frustratingly composed, a man who could win any argument without raising his voice. And now, here he was calmly agreeing to tie his life to hers like it was nothing. Charles stood, smoothing his suit jacket, his shadow stretched long against the wall, as if to remind them who truly ruled the room. "The contracts will be drawn up by tomorrow," he said. "The wedding must happen within 3 months. The press will see it as the merger of 2 dynasties, and the board will finally breathe easy." Sophie's heart pounded in her ears. She pushed back from the table, her chair scraping against the marble floor. "3 months?" she snapped. "You expect me to spend the rest of my life shackled to him because you can't handle your business without me?" Caroline's voice softened, pleading. "Sophie, think about the bigger picture. Think about the thousands of employees relying on this merger. If the companies collapse, it's not just us, it's them too." Sophie closed her eyes briefly, the weight of her mother's words pressing on her chest. She hated being guilt-tripped, but she also knew it was true. Her entire life had been woven with the family name. Wells wasn't just her identity, it was responsibility. Mark stood as well, sliding his hands into his pockets with a controlled ease that only irritated her more. "Look, I don't like this either," he said quietly, his gaze fixed on her. "But maybe we stop acting like we're the only ones affected here. If it helps, think of it as a contract, nothing more. You don't have to like me, Sophie. You just have to agree." The room fell silent again, heavy with unspoken truths. Sophie's throat felt dry, her heart racing. She hated him, hated his arrogance, hated the calm way he spoke, as if her entire future wasn't being rewritten in a single evening. And yet, she couldn't ignore the flicker of something in his eyes. Not coldness, not indifference, something closer to resignation, maybe even sadness. It caught her off guard. She turned to her father. "And if I say no?" Charles's jaw hardened. "Then you walk away knowing you let everything your grandfather built burn to ashes. You walk away knowing you could have saved us all, but didn't." Her breath caught in her chest. She looked down at her hands, trembling slightly, then at Mark, who, for the first time that night, looked less like her enemy and more like someone chained to the same fate. After a long silence, Sophie whispered, "I need time." Charles gave a curt nod. "You have 48 hours. After that, the contracts move forward, with or without your blessing." Later that night, Sophie found herself standing on the balcony of her room, staring out at the sprawling city lights. She had always imagined choosing love on her own terms, meeting someone by accident, falling hard, living a story that was hers and hers alone. Not this. Not being forced in a marriage with Mark Anderson, the one man who had always pushed her buttons, the one who had never once given her the satisfaction of winning a fight. She hugged her arms around herself, the cool night air biting her skin. Behind her, her phone buzzed. A message lit up the screen. "Mark Anderson, I don't want this any more than you do. But if we're going to do it, let's make it bearable." She stared at the message, her heart thudding. For a moment, she almost typed back something sharp, something to remind him she wasn't some pawn in his cool, collected world. But instead, her fingers hovered over the screen. Because beneath all the anger, she couldn't shake the truth. This wasn't just about family legacy anymore. It was about survival for both of them. And whether she liked it or not, Mark Anderson was the only person who understood exactly how heavy that crown was. Sophie Wells refused to be cornered. Her father's ultimatum still echoed in her head when she woke up the next morning, as heavy as a storm cloud that refused to move. She wasn't a pawn to be placed on a board, yet that was exactly how everyone seemed to see her. She dragged herself into the kitchen where her mother was already seated, as elegant as ever in a pale silk robe, sipping tea like nothing in the world could shake her. Sophie sat opposite her, eyes dark from lack of sleep, hands wrapped tightly around her coffee mug. "You really believe in this madness?" she asked. Caroline sighed, not surprised by her daughter's sharp tone. "I believe in family, and in protecting what generations before us built. Sometimes, Sophie, love comes later." Sophie laughed bitterly. "Or it doesn't come at all. You want me to tie myself to Mark Anderson like he's some savior? He's not. He's cold, arrogant, and—" She stopped herself, pressing her lips together. The truth was, Mark wasn't entirely what she thought, but she wasn't about to admit that to her mother. Caroline set her cup down, voice calm but firm. "You don't have to like it, Sophie. You only have to do it." By noon, Sophie had escaped the suffocating atmosphere of the Wells penthouse and driven into the city. Her best friend, Lila Hayes, was waiting at their favorite cafe with 2 lattes already on the table. "You look like someone tried to sell you on a lifetime sentence," Lila said as Sophie dropped into the chair. "Because they did," Sophie muttered, running her hands through her hair. "My father's trying to force me into marrying Mark Anderson." Lila blinked, stunned for all of 2 seconds before a slow grin crept onto her face. "Wait, Mark Anderson? As in Anderson Enterprises? As in tall, dark, and terrifying?" Sophie groaned. "Don't romanticize him. He's as insufferable as ever. This isn't about him. It's about my father turning my future into a business deal." Lila leaned closer, voice lowering. "So what are you going to do? Run? Rebel?" Sophie shook her head. "Fight. I'll fight it with everything I have. There has to be another way." Yet as she said it, her resolve felt thinner than she wanted it to be. That evening, when Sophie returned to Wells Tower, her mood worsened at the sight of a sleek black car parked by the entrance. Leaning casually against it, phone in hand, was Mark Anderson himself. His presence was like a punch to the gut, tall, sharp, and impossible to ignore. "What are you doing here?" Sophie demanded before she even reached him. Mark glanced up, slipping his phone into his pocket. "Relax. I'm not stalking you. Your father asked me to come by. We're supposed to discuss terms." Sophie crossed her arms tightly. "Well, I'm not interested." Mark's expression didn't change. "Neither am I. But unless you've got a brilliant plan to save $2 billion empires overnight, I suggest you start facing reality." His words stung more than she cared to admit. She opened her mouth to argue, but he stepped closer, his tone shifting slightly. "Look, I don't want this any more than you do. But it's not about what we want. It's about what we owe. To our families. To everything they built." Sophie scoffed. "Spare me the lecture, Anderson. You talk like you're noble, but you're just as trapped as I am. Don't pretend otherwise." For a moment, something flickered in his eyes, something she couldn't place, but then it was gone. He straightened, adjusting his cufflinks like the conversation meant nothing. "You've got 48 hours, he said evenly. "Decide whether you want to burn it all to the ground or find a way to survive it. Your choice." He walked back to his car, his movements as precise and controlled as always, and drove off without another glance. Sophie stood rooted to the pavement, anger burning in her chest, though she couldn't tell if it was directed at him or herself. Later that night, when her phone buzzed on the nightstand, her stomach tightened at the name on the screen. Mark Anderson. The message was short, clipped exactly like him. "Dinner tomorrow. Not business. Just us. Say yes." Sophie stared at it, her fingers hovering over the screen. She hated him. She hated the arrogance in every word. And yet, part of her couldn't shake the feeling that dinner with Mark wasn't about choice at all. It was another step toward the inevitable marriage she had sworn she wouldn't agree to, but already felt herself being dragged into. Sophie Wells hated the silence of the Wells boardroom. It always felt like the walls themselves were judging her, waiting for her to fold under the weight of her father's expectations. That morning, she sat stiffly in her chair, eyes fixed on the gleaming table while her father, Richard Wells, and Thomas Anderson, Mark's father, laid out documents thick enough to be a prison sentence. Across from her sat Mark, unreadable as ever in his perfectly tailored suit, his dark eyes occasionally flicking to her before settling back on the papers in front of him. "It's simple," Thomas said, his voice booming with authority. "The Wells and Anderson legacy needs this merger. Individually, our companies will bleed. Together, they'll thrive. The marriage is the symbol and the seal. Investors will see stability. The public will see strength." Richard nodded in agreement. "Our families have carried the weight of empire for decades. It's time for the next generation to take responsibility." Sophie's hands curled into fists in her lap. "You're asking me to marry someone I don't love?" she said, her voice quiet but cutting. "You're asking me to sacrifice my entire life for your empire?" Her father's gaze hardened. "I'm not asking, Sophie. I'm telling you. This is bigger than feelings." She turned to Mark, hoping for support, but he only leaned back in his chair, calm as stone. When he finally spoke, his tone was steady. "I don't love this either, but it's the only option we have." The words landed like a punch, sharp and heavy. Sophie wanted to argue, to scream, but what good would it do? The contracts were already being drawn. The date was already being whispered, and every path she looked at led to the same end. She left the boardroom with her chest burning, her heels clicking against the marble floor as she stormed down the corridor. Mark caught up with her outside the elevator, his steps unhurried, his voice irritatingly calm. "Throwing a tantrum won't change anything." She spun on him, her eyes flashing. "You think I'm just going to roll over and say vows because two old men decided we should?" His jaw tightened, though his expression barely shifted. "You're not the only one trapped, Wells. You think I want this? I wanted to make my own choices too. But right now, choice isn't on the table. Responsibility is." She glared at him, frustrated by his composure, by how he could sound so logical while she felt like she was drowning. "You're cold," she spat. "Completely cold." He didn't flinch. "Maybe, but at least I'm realistic." The elevator doors opened and she stepped inside, refusing to look at him again. The ride down felt suffocating, her reflection in the mirrored walls showing a woman she barely recognized, angry, cornered but powerless. By the time she reached the ground floor, her phone was buzzing with messages from Lila. "Tell me everything. Did you say no? Did you walk out?" Sophie typed back quickly, "It's worse than I thought. They're locking me in, and Mark's playing along." She didn't add what unsettled her most, that he didn't seem happy about it either, that his resignation made it harder to paint him as the enemy. The following week became a blur of fittings, contracts, and endless press preparations. The Wells and Anderson names were too big to hide something like this. The media had already sniffed out rumors, and headlines speculating about a power couple marriage began to appear online. Sophie hated every second of it. At a dress fitting, She stood on the pedestal in front of the mirror while designers fussed over silk and lace. She barely recognized the woman staring back. "You look stunning," Caroline said softly from the corner of the room, her voice warm but laced with an ache Sophie couldn't ignore. "I don't feel stunning," Sophie replied flatly. "I feel like I'm being gift-wrapped for display." Her mother flinched but said nothing, her silence louder than any defense she could have given. Meanwhile, Mark handled his side of the circus with the same stoic precision as always. Sophie caught glimpses of him at events, press meetings, corporate dinners, always composed, always saying exactly the right thing. To the outside world, he was the perfect heir, stepping seamlessly into his role. To Sophie, he was a reminder of the bars closing around her. One evening, just days before the wedding, Sophie found herself alone on the balcony of her parents' estate, the city lights sprawling endlessly before her. Mark appeared silently, a glass in his hand, his presence as unshakable as the night air. "You've gone quiet lately," he said, standing beside her but not too close. She didn't look at him. "What's there to say? In a few days, I'll be Mrs. Anderson whether I like it or not. Congratulations, you win." His jaw tightened at her tone, and for a rare moment, his calm exterior cracked. "You think this is winning? Sophie, this is survival. For both of us." She turned to him then, searching his face for arrogance, for smugness, but found only exhaustion, the same weight she felt pressing on her own shoulders. It unsettled her more than anger ever could. She wanted to hate him. She needed to. But the more she saw that he was just as trapped, the harder it became to keep the lines clean. When the wedding day arrived, Sophie walked down the aisle with her heart pounding like a war drum. Cameras flashed, guests whispered, and at the end of the aisle stood Mark, steady and unreadable. Every step felt like surrender, every vow like another chain snapping into place. And yet, as she slid the ring onto his finger, and he did the same for her, she saw the faintest flicker in his eyes, a silent acknowledgement, not of love, but of the cage they now shared. For the world, it was a celebration. For Sophie, it was the beginning of a sentence she didn't know how to serve. The applause from their wedding day had barely faded before reality set in. Sophie sat at the head of a long mahogany dining table in the Anderson penthouse. No, not penthouse, she refused to call it that. It was a towering glass apartment in Manhattan, sleek and sterile, as if it had been designed more for appearances than comfort. Mark sat at the opposite end, his jacket draped neatly over the back of his chair, his attention fixed on the screen of his phone. They had been married for 72 hours, and she could already feel the weight of silence pressing on her chest. "This doesn't feel like a marriage," she muttered finally, her fork clinking against her untouched plate. Mark's eyes flicked up briefly. "It's not meant to feel like one. It's a contract. We fulfill it. That's all." His voice was even, but the casual dismissal made her blood boil. "Do you ever stop being the perfect corporate robot?" she snapped. He set his phone down slowly, his gaze steady. "Do you ever stop fighting everything? You think I asked for this? You think I want to sit across from someone glaring at me like I ruined her life?" Sophie pushed her chair back with a screech, standing abruptly. "You didn't ruin my life, Mark. Our fathers did. But you—" She jabbed a finger toward him, her voice rising. "You're letting them win. You're just sitting there, playing along like a good little soldier while I suffocate." For a moment, he said nothing, just studied her with that maddening composure. Then, quietly, "I'm surviving, Sophie. There's a difference." She wanted to argue, but the exhaustion in his tone caught her off guard. She folded her arms instead, muttering under her breath, "Some survival." That night, she lay awake in the cavernous master bedroom they now shared, staring at the ceiling while Mark worked late in his office. The bed between them felt like a battlefield line neither dared to cross. Every tick of the clock was a reminder. This was her life now. A beautiful cage. A few days later, they attended their first charity gala as husband and wife. Cameras flashed as they walked in arm, their smiles practiced, their bodies close enough for show but cold beneath the surface. Sophie whispered through her smile, "You should win an award for pretending." Mark leaned slightly, his lips curving just enough for the cameras. "Funny, I was thinking the same about you. Onlookers saw a golden couple, the heirs of two empires, flawless and enviable. But beneath the glittering lights, Sophie's nails dug into her clutch so hard her knuckles ached. Back in their apartment, the mask slipped. Sophie kicked off her heels and threw her clutch onto the sofa. Do you even realize what just happened? We just sold ourselves to a room full of people who don't care if we're miserable. Mark loosened his tie, unbothered. That's the point. They believe the story. And as long as they believe it, the companies stay strong. Isn't that what you wanted, to protect your father's empire? Don't twist this on me, she shot back. I wanted a choice. You think hiding behind this perfect act makes you noble, but it just makes you a coward. His head snapped up, his eyes darkening in a way that made her heart lurch despite herself. Careful, Sophie. The warning in his voice sent a shiver down her spine. Not of fear, but of something she didn't want to name. She turned away quickly, muttering whatever. I'm done talking to you. Weeks passed, and the routine of their marriage settled into something sharp and brittle. Mornings were filled with polite distance, evenings with unspoken tension. Yet, somewhere in the cracks of their battles, Sophie began to notice things she hadn't before. The way Mark would pause during late-night calls to check if she'd eaten. The way he always angled his body toward her in public, shielding her from the overwhelming press of cameras. The way exhaustion softened his features when he thought no one was watching. She told herself it meant nothing, that noticing these things didn't change what he was, the enemy she'd been forced to marry. But late at night, when the silence stretched too long, she found herself wondering if he was as trapped as she was, or if, maybe, he was just better at hiding it. Their first real clash came one Friday evening, when Sophie decided to skip a corporate dinner their fathers had arranged. She was curled on the couch in leggings, flipping through a book, when Mark stormed in, his tie loose, his patience gone. Where the hell were you? He demanded. She didn't even look up. Home. Where else would I be? He stepped closer, his voice low but seething. You made me walk into that dinner alone. Do you know how that looked? Do you know what kind of questions I had to dodge? Sophie snapped her book shut and stood, meeting his glare. I don't care how it looked, Mark. I'm tired of being paraded around like a prize cow. If our fathers want this marriage so badly, maybe they should have married each other instead. For the first time, his composure cracked. He laughed, a short, bitter sound. God, you're impossible. She folded her arms. And you're insufferable. Maybe this cage would feel less suffocating if you weren't in it with me. The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. For a moment, neither moved, both breathing hard, both refusing to back down. Then, slowly, Mark's expression shifted. His jaw unclenched, his gaze softened, and he said quietly, You really think I'm not suffocating too? The honesty in his voice caught her off guard, and for once, she didn't have a comeback. That night, Sophie lay awake again, her mind replaying his words, the flicker of vulnerability she'd glimpsed. She hated that it unsettled her, that it planted a seed of doubt in her determination to despise him. Because if Mark Anderson wasn't the villain, then what was he? And what did that make her, standing in the same cage with him? Sophie never thought the word husband would feel so foreign on her tongue. Weeks had turned into months, and still, every time she glanced across the apartment and saw Mark, it felt like looking at a stranger she happened to share paperwork with. Their arguments had become routine, almost a rhythm of their marriage. He would call her reckless. She would call him cold. He would accuse her of shirking duty. She would accuse him of suffocating her. And yet, beneath the sharp edges of their words, Sophie had begun to feel something that disturbed her more than any fight ever could: awareness. It snuck up on her when she least expected it. Like the morning she padded barefoot into the kitchen, hair messy from sleep, and found Mark at the counter in a plain white t-shirt, sleeves rolled up as he made coffee. His hair was damp from the shower, his jaw shadowed with stubble, and when he looked up at her with that quiet, assessing gaze, her breath caught in her throat before she could stop it. She told herself it was nothing, just surprise, just the novelty of seeing him out of his perfect tailored armor. But later, when he handed her a mug without a word and their fingers brushed, a jolt ran through her so sharp it left her rattled for hours. Their fathers, oblivious to the storm brewing between them, pushed harder than ever. More galas, more boardroom meetings, more photo opportunities that painted Sophie and Mark as the golden couple of two legacies intertwined. One evening, after a particularly grueling charity dinner, Sophie stormed into their apartment, yanking off her earrings and tossing them onto the couch. "I'm not your doll," she snapped. "I can't keep pretending to smile while they all watch us like we're some kind of circus act." Mark loosened his tie and exhaled, the weight of his restraint visible in the set of his shoulders. "You think I enjoy it? You think I want to shake hands with men twice my age who only care about how many zeros are in our family accounts?" Sophie froze, caught off guard by the crack in his voice, the edge of frustration that mirrored her own. For the first time, she saw it. He was tired too. But instead of saying so, she scoffed. "Then why do you always look like you're fine with it?" His eyes flicked to hers, and something sharp and unguarded passed between them. "Because someone has to hold it together," he said quietly. The words lingered long after he left the room, like a weight she couldn't shake. The turning point came on a stormy Friday night. Rain lashed against the tall windows as Sophie tried to wrestle with a broken lock on her balcony door. She muttered curses under her breath, yanking at it with growing frustration, until suddenly Mark appeared at her side. "You're going to hurt yourself," he said, reaching past her. His hand brushed hers, firm and steady, and before she could snap back, the lock clicked into place with ease under his grip. Sophie spun toward him, bristling. "I could have done that." His lips quirked in the faintest smirk. "Sure, maybe by next week." She glared at him, but her pulse betrayed her, quick and unsteady. For a moment, the air between them felt charged, the storm outside echoing the storm inside her chest. She stepped back quickly, muttering, "Thanks," and hurried into the living room, desperate to shake the unsettling warmth spreading through her. Later that night, the power flickered out, plunging their apartment into darkness. Sophie lit a candle, the warm glow softening the edges of the room. She found Mark sitting on the sofa, his phone useless in the outage, his expression oddly boyish without the constant glow of responsibility around him. "You look different," she blurted before she could stop herself. He raised a brow. "Different how?" She swallowed. "Less like a machine. More human." To her surprise, he chuckled, a low sound that curled through her like smoke. "I'll take that as a compliment." She looked away quickly, embarrassed by how her cheeks warmed. The silence stretched, but it wasn't hostile like before. It was heavy, alive. Sophie sank into the armchair across from him, pulling her legs up as the candle flickered between them. The storm raged outside, but inside, it felt strangely intimate, too intimate for two people who had spent months building walls. She caught herself staring at him again, at the way the candlelight played against the sharp lines of his face, at the quiet intensity in his eyes when he wasn't hiding behind his usual control. He noticed. Of course he noticed. His gaze met hers, and instead of looking away, he held it. "What?" he asked softly, as if afraid to break the moment. Sophie's throat went dry. She opened her mouth, then closed it, shaking her head quickly. "Nothing. Forget it." But her heart thudded hard against her ribs, and she knew, deep down, it wasn't nothing. The power returned an hour later, the spell breaking as abruptly as it had begun. Mark stood, smoothing his shirt, slipping his mask of composure back into place. "Good night, Sophie," he said evenly, retreating toward his office. But Sophie stayed in the armchair long after he was gone, her chest tight, her mind racing. She hated the thought, hated that it even existed, but whispered anyway, insistent and undeniable. She was starting to see him differently. And if she wasn't careful, the man she had sworn to hate might become the man she couldn't ignore. The following week, Sophie found herself standing in front of a mirror, adjusting the neckline of a gown she didn't even want to wear. The invitation had come directly from her father, a whispered reminder that tonight's gala was crucial for both families' reputations. "Smile, Sophie," he had said over the phone, "and remember, the world needs to believe in your marriage." She had bitten her tongue, resisting the urge to remind him that belief had nothing to do with reality. When she emerged from the bedroom, Mark was already waiting in the living room. He looked impossibly composed in a tailored suit, his tie a deep navy that set off his eyes. Sophie hated the flicker of admiration that stirred in her chest before she buried it under irritation. "Ready?" he asked, his tone even. "As I'll ever be," she replied, brushing past him. The gala was held in a grand hotel ballroom, chandeliers glittering overhead, the hum of wealth and influence filling the space. Cameras flashed the moment they arrived, capturing the image of a perfect couple. Mark's hand settled lightly at the small of her back, guiding her through the crowd, and Sophie stiffened at the contact. But when a cluster of reporters closed in, she forced a smile, leaning closer to him as though his touch were welcome. "How's married life treating you both?" one of them asked, voice eager. Sophie opened her mouth to answer with something polite and vague. But Mark spoke first, his tone smooth and practiced. "Better than I imagined," he said, glancing down at her with a faint smile that looked almost real. For a moment, Sophie forgot to breathe. He was lying, of course, but he made it sound so convincing that her heart betrayed her with an uneven beat. She quickly composed herself, murmuring, "Yes, it's been an adjustment, but a good one." The reporters scribbled, satisfied, and moved on. As the night wore on, Sophie drifted from conversation to conversation, glass of champagne in hand, while Mark remained at her side, a steady presence. She caught herself watching him more than once. The way he listened intently when others spoke, the way his jaw tightened whenever someone mentioned business, the way his eyes flicked toward her as though to check she was still within reach. It unsettled her, that small, unspoken tether between them. But it was during the dance that everything shifted. She hadn't planned on dancing at all, but when a well-known investor approached and insisted, Mark smoothly intercepted, claiming his rights as her husband. Before she could protest, his hand was at her waist, pulling her onto the floor. The music swelled around them, soft and romantic, and Sophie's pulse tripped. "You didn't have to," she muttered, her gaze darting away. "You looked like you wanted to say no," he said simply, guiding her in time to the music. His hand was warm against her back, his movements assured, and she hated how aware she was of every inch of space, or lack thereof, between them. She tried to focus on a chandelier above, on the glittering crowd, but her eyes betrayed her, flicking up to his. He was already watching her, his expression unreadable. For a dizzying moment, she thought she saw something there, something softer, something that didn't belong in a marriage built on duty. She broke the gaze quickly, her throat tight, and forced herself to breathe. When the dance ended, Mark released her gently, and the spell shattered. But the awareness lingered, trailing her through the rest of the night, following her even as they left the gala and rode home in silence. The car hummed quietly, city lights streaking past, and Sophie stared out the window, trying to steady her thoughts. Mark sat beside her, composed as ever, but she felt the weight of him like gravity. The following days didn't make it easier. A new deal between their families required them to travel together to Chicago for a weekend of meetings with stakeholders. It was the first time they had left New York since the wedding, and Sophie bristled at the thought of being trapped in close quarters with him for 3 full days. But there was no avoiding it. They boarded the jet together, photographers snapping as they walked across the tarmac, and Sophie plastered on her best smile even as tension knotted in her stomach. Once inside, she sank into a leather seat, pulling out her tablet to distract herself. Mark sat across from her, expression unreadable, his gaze flicking toward her now and then. The silence stretched between them, thick and uneasy. Finally, he said, "You don't have to hate me, you know." Sophie's head snapped up, startled. "Who says I hate you?" "Your eyes," he replied simply, and she swallowed, caught off guard by his honesty. She turned back to her tablet, pretending his words hadn't landed. That night in Chicago, after a long day of meetings and forced politeness, Sophie collapsed onto the hotel bed with a sigh. The suite was spacious but shared, a fact that irritated her more than she wanted to admit. Mark emerged from the bathroom, hair damp, wearing a plain gray t-shirt that clung to his shoulders. Sophie froze, heat rushing unbidden to her face before she rolled over and faced the other way. "This arrangement is ridiculous," she muttered, more to herself than to him. "You're right," he said after a pause. She blinked, surprised. "I am. We shouldn't have to live like actors on a stage." She hesitated, then asked softly, "So why do we?" He exhaled slowly. "Because it's what was asked of us." The quiet stretched between them, and Sophie felt a pang she couldn't name. She wanted to argue, to throw another barb his way, but the exhaustion of the day and the sincerity in his voice silenced her. Instead, she closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing thoughts. Somewhere deep inside, she knew she was standing at the edge of something dangerous, something she couldn't control. For the first time, she wondered if her hatred of Mark was less about him, and more about the terrifying possibility of what might grow between them if she let her guard down. The Chicago trip ended with the same polite smiles and calculated handshakes that had defined every move since the wedding, but something about the city clung to Sophie on the flight back. Maybe it was the way the world seemed smaller outside of New York, or maybe it was the memory of their conversation in the hotel room. Mark's voice low, his honesty slipping past his walls. Either way, she carried it home like an unwelcome souvenir, refusing to admit how much it had unsettled her. For the next few days, she avoided him as best she could. She left early for her own commitments, returned late, and made herself scarce in the apartment. But avoidance had a way of making the inevitable sharper when it finally came. It happened one evening when she returned to find Mark in the living room. Jacket off, sleeves rolled, papers spread across the coffee table. He looked up as she entered, his expression tight. "We need to talk," he said. Sophie sighed, dropping her purse onto the chair. "That's never a good sign. Your father called me today." Mark began, his tone clipped. "He's worried about your commitment." Sophie stiffened. "My commitment?" "Yes. He thinks you're disengaged." Sophie laughed bitterly. "Disengaged? I didn't choose this marriage, Mark. I didn't sign up to be paraded around like a trophy for the sake of two companies." His jaw tightened, his voice rising. "And you think I did? You think this is the life I wanted?" Sophie crossed her arms, heat flooding her chest. "At least you look like you belong in it. At least you know how to smile and nod and play perfect." "Someone has to," he shot back, standing now, his height towering over her. "Someone has to hold this circus together, and God forbid it be you, right?" The words hit harder than she expected, cutting through her defenses. She opened her mouth to retort, but stopped when she saw his face, tense, frustrated, but beneath it, something raw, something tired. "You think I don't feel trapped too?" he said, his voice lower now, almost pained. "Every morning I wake up, and I remind myself this isn't about me. It's about legacy, duty. And then I look at you, and you can't even pretend for 5 minutes that maybe we're in this together." His words lingered, heavy and unyielding. Sophie's throat tightened, guilt pricking at the edges of her anger. She hadn't thought of it that way, not really. She had been so consumed with her resentment that she hadn't considered his cage might be just as suffocating. She looked away, her chest tight. "I never asked for this," she whispered. "Neither did I," he said, softer now, and when she glanced back, his eyes were on her, unguarded for once. The silence between them stretched, thick and charged. Sophie realized how close they had drifted, only a breath apart. Her pulse hammered, her skin alive with awareness she didn't want to name. She told herself to step back, to cut the tension with another sharp remark, but she couldn't move. Not when his gaze dropped briefly to her lips. Not when the air felt heavy enough to drown in. The world tilted in that moment, everything else falling away. His hand lifted, slow, uncertain, until his fingers brushed lightly against her cheek. Sophie's breath caught, her body frozen. He wasn't Mark the business heir, not then. He was just a man, standing inches from her, looking at her like he wasn't supposed to. "Sophie," he began, his voice husky, but the rest was lost in the electricity buzzing between them. She swayed forward before she could think, her lips parting just slightly, the space between them shrinking until the doorbell rang. The sound shattered the moment like glass. Sophie jerked back, heart racing, and Mark's hand fell to his side, his expression shuddering in an instant. She stumbled toward the door, grateful for the excuse, and opened it to find a delivery man holding a package. She thanked him quickly, shutting the door and turning back to see Mark already gathering his papers, his posture stiff, his face unreadable. "I have work to finish," he said flatly, disappearing into his office before she could say a word. Sophie stood in the middle of the room, chest heaving, the weight of the almost kiss hanging in the air like smoke. She pressed a hand to her cheek where his fingers had touched, the warmth still lingering. She hated herself for wanting it, hated how badly her body had betrayed her. But deep down, buried under denial, she knew the truth. Something had shifted tonight, and no matter how hard they tried, there was no going back. The morning headlines exploded like wildfire across New York City. Sophie sat at the long dining table in the Westbrook's estate, staring at the bold letters on her phone screen. Westbrook and Harrington merger in trouble. Anonymous insider leaks suggest fraud. Her stomach tightened. This wasn't just gossip, it was a threat. She pushed the phone aside just as Mark walked in, jacket slung over his shoulder, tie undone as though he hadn't even bothered to finish dressing. His jaw was sharp, tense, his eyes already storming. "You saw it." Sophie nodded slowly. "I saw it. I don't need to ask if you believe it." "I don't," Mark snapped, pacing the length of the table. "But the rest of the city does. Our parents will too. The press won't leave this alone. We're talking investors pulling out, board members panicking. This could burn down everything we've been forced to hold together." She folded her arms, watching him pace. She had never seen him like this, his composure cracking, his confidence shaken. "Do you know who leaked it?" "I've got people tracing it," he muttered. "But I have a feeling this isn't just random. Someone is trying to use us. Use this marriage. And the worst part? It's working." Her pulse quickened. For the first time since the wedding, she didn't feel like a pawn or a reluctant wife. She felt like someone standing on the edge of a battlefield with him. And oddly enough, the thought didn't scare her. "What do you want me to do?" she asked quietly. That caught his attention. He stopped pacing and looked at her, really looked at her, as though surprised she had even asked. His voice softened. "You'd help me?" She lifted her chin. "Mark, this isn't just your family's business. It's mine too. Whether I like it or not, my name is tied to yours now. I'm not about to sit back and let someone ruin us." Something flickered in his eyes, something unreadable but not cold. He exhaled and dropped into the chair across from her, running a hand through his hair. "We'll need to present a united front. No cracks, no rumors of discord. They need to see us as unshakable. Do you think you can play the role?" Sophie smirked faintly. "I don't have to play. If someone is trying to bring us down, then they just declared war. And I don't lose wars." For a second, silence hovered between them. The air seemed heavier, tighter, as if they were both realizing the shift. They were no longer just reluctant strangers tied by marriage. They were partners with a common enemy. By noon, they were already side by side at Harrington Tower, flashing forced smiles to cameras as they entered. The boardroom was packed, every seat filled with anxious faces. Sophie had expected to be sidelined, but to her surprise, Mark pulled out a chair for her beside him at the head of the table. "Our marriage has brought speculation," Mark began, his voice steady, commanding. "But let me make one thing clear, the merger stands. Westbrook and Harrington remains the strongest alliance in this city, and any attempt to divide us is a waste of time." Sophie leaned forward, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "The leak is being investigated, and legal action will follow. But in the meantime, you will all continue to do your jobs. You will keep the machine running. And if anyone here doubts our ability to handle this, you're welcome to step aside." The silence that followed was heavy, but Sophie felt a spark of adrenaline in her chest. Mark's hand brushed against hers under the table, a fleeting, accidental touch, but neither of them moved away. Hours later, after the board meeting finally ended and the press conference was behind them, Sophie and Mark found themselves alone in his office, exhaustion hanging between them like a fog. She kicked off her heels, sinking into the couch. "I can't believe I just threatened a room full of billionaires and CEOs. Who even am I?" Mark chuckled, loosening his tie. "You were brilliant. They needed to hear it from you as much as from me. You gave them no room to question whether you belong here. Her lips curved slightly. And do I belong here? His gaze lingered on her, long enough to make her pulse flutter. You belong everywhere. You just haven't realized it yet. Something in his tone sent a ripple through her. She looked away, suddenly too aware of how close they were, how the tension between them wasn't just business anymore. "Mark," she whispered, "what if this gets worse? What if the leak is just the beginning?" "Then we fight harder," he said simply. Together, her eyes lifted to his, and for a moment, the air shifted again, warmer, more dangerous. She realized then that somewhere along this forced path, the idea of being with him didn't feel like a trap anymore. It felt like inevitability. But just as quickly, he broke the gaze, straightening his jacket. "Get some rest, Sophie. Tomorrow will be worse." And with that, he walked out, leaving her heart pounding and her thoughts spinning. She leaned back against the couch, staring at the ceiling, wondering how long it would take before they stopped pretending this was only about saving the family business. Because she could feel it now. Something deeper was coming, something neither of them would be able to resist. The news hit like a storm. Every major financial outlet was running with the same headline: Harrington Wells merger in jeopardy amidst internal betrayal. Screens flashed the words again and again, stock tickers plummeting in real time. Sophie sat frozen in her office, her phone buzzing with panic calls from investors, her father's number flashing insistently across the screen. But she couldn't answer. Not yet. Not until she knew who had stabbed them in the back. Mark burst into her office without knocking, his expression dark, his tie loosened like he had ripped it halfway off in frustration. "It's one of ours," he said flatly, throwing a folder onto her desk. "Not an outsider. Someone on the inside sold confidential information to the press." Sophie flipped open the folder with trembling hands. Page after page of emails, bank transfers, backdoor communications. She felt her stomach drop when she recognized the name at the top. "Lydia Carrington," she whispered, barely able to believe it. Lydia had been her family's trusted advisor for years, practically part of the household. Mark nodded grimly. She leaked the merger documents, and she got paid handsomely for it, enough to vanish if she wants. For a long moment, Sophie couldn't breathe. The betrayal cut deep, not just professionally, but personally. "She was supposed to be on our side," she murmured. "She promised me she'd protect the Wells account while the merger finalized." "She looked me in the eye, Mark." "I know." His voice softened slightly, but only for her. "I know it hurts, but right now, we can't afford to wallow in betrayal. We have to move." Sophie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "We should call the board. Issue a statement. We have to reassure the investors before this gets worse." Mark stepped into her path, his jaw tight. "No, not yet. If we go public before we lock her out completely, she'll just spin it to make us look incompetent. We need evidence. Hard evidence. Enough to bury her if she tries to twist this." Their eyes clashed, hers wide with fear, his hard with determination. For a second, Sophie wanted to scream, to push back against his relentless calm. But deep down, she knew he was right. If they made one wrong move, everything their families built would collapse. Hours blurred together as they worked side by side, tracing Lydia's trail of deceit. Sophie typed furiously, pulling old financial reports, while Mark made call after call, leveraging every connection he had. Their voices occasionally clashed, sharp words, frayed tempers. But beneath the tension, there was a strange kind of unity. For the first time, Sophie realized that when they stood together, they were unstoppable. By midnight, Sophie slumped back in her chair, exhaustion tugging at her bones. Mark was still pacing, phone pressed to his ear, his voice low but commanding. She watched him in silence for a moment, the sharp lines of his face illuminated by the glow of the city lights outside. How had she spent so long hating this man? He was infuriating, arrogant, stubborn, but he was also brilliant. Steady, reliable in a way she hadn't expected. He hung up finally, his shoulders loosening just slightly as he exhaled. "It's done. Lydia's accounts are frozen. She won't be able to touch a cent of what she made from this." Sophie blinked, relief washing over her. "So, it's over?" Not quite. Tomorrow, we go public with the evidence. We show the world exactly who betrayed us, and we do it together. The word together lingered in the air. Sophie felt her heart stutter. She swallowed hard, nodding. Okay, together. For a moment, silence stretched between them, heavy but not uncomfortable. Mark's eyes lingered on her, softer now, almost searching. You did good today, he said quietly. She gave a small laugh, weary but genuine. So did you. The corner of his mouth curved upward, the faintest hint of a smile. He stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. Sophie's pulse quickened, her breath catching. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her. The thought both terrified and thrilled her. But then he stopped, his hand brushing lightly against hers instead. Just a touch, subtle, fleeting, but it sent a jolt through her chest. Get some rest, he murmured. Tomorrow will be a war. And then he left, the door clicking softly shut behind him, leaving Sophie alone with her racing thoughts. She touched her hand where his fingers had grazed hers, her chest tight. Somewhere along the line, amidst the chaos and betrayal, something between them had shifted. She wasn't sure what it meant. She wasn't sure she was ready to face it. But one thing was clear. Tomorrow, when they stood in front of the cameras and the world, it wouldn't just be about saving their parents' empire anymore. It would be about saving each other. The press conference hall buzzed with tension. Cameras flashed like lightning, reporters jostling for better angles, microphones angled toward the podium. Sophie smoothed her navy blazer with trembling fingers, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She could feel the weight of the world pressing down on her shoulders. Every investor, every family member, every enemy watching, waiting to see if she and Mark would crumble. Mark stood beside her, tall and steady, his expression carved from stone. If he was nervous, he didn't show it. Sophie envied his calm, but she also drew strength from it. She leaned ever so slightly toward him, their shoulders brushing. He didn't flinch. Instead, his hand dropped casually to cover hers where it rested on the podium, a small anchor in the storm. When the cameras finally quieted, Mark spoke first, his voice strong and unwavering. Ladies and gentlemen, the rumors are true. Our merger faced an attempted sabotage. But the truth is not what you've been led to believe. This was not incompetence. It was betrayal. From someone we trusted. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sophie stepped forward, her voice firm despite the ache in her chest. Lydia Carrington exploited her access and sold confidential information, risking not just the merger, but the livelihoods of thousands of employees. Today, we stand united, not as two families forced together, but as partners determined to protect what our parents built. The flashbulbs exploded. Reporters shouted questions, but Sophie and Mark held their ground, presenting the evidence, detailing Lydia's betrayal, and finally showing that her accounts had been frozen. By the end, the story was no longer one of collapse, but of survival, of resilience. When they stepped away from the podium, Sophie felt her knees weaken. But Mark was there instantly, steadying her with a firm hand at her back. You were perfect, he murmured. She laughed shakily. Perfect? I thought I was shaking the whole time. You were strong, he corrected. That's what they needed to see. Back at the Wells estate that evening, the atmosphere shifted. Their parents, who had once pushed this marriage like a chess move, now looked at them with something different in their eyes, pride. Sophie's father clasped Mark's hand. You've proven yourself, son, not just to this family, but to the business. And then, to Sophie, he said more softly, You've grown into more than I ever expected, Sophie. You're not just your mother's daughter, you're a leader. For the first time in years, Sophie felt the sting of tears at her father's words. She swallowed hard, nodding. Later, when the noise of celebration faded and the house settled into quiet, Sophie found herself standing on the balcony, staring out at the city lights. The empire they had fought so hard to protect glittered below her, beautiful and untouchable. Mark joined her, leaning against the railing. For a while, they stood in silence, the cool night breeze wrapping around them. Finally, Sophie spoke. When we got married, I thought it was a prison sentence. A lifetime chained to someone I didn't choose. Mark chuckled under his breath. Trust me, I felt the same. She turned her head, smiling despite herself. And yet here we are. Somehow, I don't regret it anymore. His eyes met hers, steady and unguarded. Neither do I. The silence stretched, heavier now, charged with something unspoken. Sophie's heart pounded, but this time she didn't fight it. She took a small step closer, and he didn't move away. Mark lifted a hand, brushing a loose strand of hair from her cheek. His touch lingered, warm against her skin. You drive me insane, he admitted softly. But somewhere along the line, I stopped seeing you as my enemy. And I started seeing you as everything I didn't know I needed. Sophie's breath caught. For once, she didn't overthink. She rose on her toes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was tentative at first, then deepened as his arms slid around her waist, pulling her against him. It wasn't the clash of two stubborn heirs anymore. It was a promise, a beginning. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Sophie rested her forehead against his. So what happens now? Mark smiled, genuine and unguarded in a way she'd never seen before. Now, we stopped pretending this was just about business. Now it's about us. And for the first time since their wedding day, Sophie believed it. Not because their parents demanded it, not because the empire needed saving, but because she wanted it. Because somewhere between the fights, the betrayal, and the chaos, she had fallen in love with her husband. The marriage that began as a contract had become something far more powerful, a love worth fighting for. Please like my videos, comment, and subscribe to help me grow.